A young nun disappears from a quiet convent. No search. No report. No goodbye. 20 years later, her body is found buried beneath the chapel where everyone prayed above her. Someone ordered the silence. Someone protected the truth. And the one person who could explain everything vanished. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications, because stories like this are rarely told, and even more rarely solved. In a quiet hill town called Ravenshade, a place known for prayer and silence hid a secret so dark it remained buried, literally, for more than 20 years. Inside the stone walls of Saint Eloria Convent, a young nun named Sister Maribel Vale disappeared without a trace. No blood. No struggle. No public investigation. Just a gentle announcement during morning prayers that she had left the order. But she hadn't left. She was beneath them, buried under the chapel floor where hymns echoed every morning. For 2 decades, the faithful knelt only meters above a body no one was supposed to find. And at the center of the mystery stood one woman, Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright, a leader known for discipline, devotion, and absolute control. When the truth finally surfaced, the convent was already empty. The files were gone. The witnesses were silent. And the woman who knew everything had vanished. Stay with me until the end, because what happened inside Saint Eloria was not just a crime. It was a perfectly hidden betrayal. On the morning of March 14, 2004, Saint Eloria Convent followed its usual routine. Bells rang at 5:30. The sisters filed into the chapel in perfect rows. Candles were lit. Silence ruled. One seat was empty. Sister Maribel Vale had joined the order only 3 years earlier. She was known for her soft voice, steady hands, and a strange habit of writing letters late at night in the convent archive room. Some sisters whispered she planned to leave the order. Others said she had been called into private meetings with Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright far too often. At breakfast, no one mentioned her absence. By noon, the explanation arrived. Mother Celestine gathered the sisters and calmly announced that Maribel had been released from her vows and transferred to another religious house. No address. No farewell. No paperwork shown. The message was simple: do not ask questions. The sisters obeyed. But one person noticed something that would never make sense. Maribel's shoes were still by her bed. Her rosary still hung on the post. And her locked wooden trunk, containing her letters, journals, and personal effects, remained untouched. Sister Maribel Vale had vanished. But nothing she owned had gone with her. The first person to quietly question Maribel's disappearance was Sister Helena Dorsey. She had shared cleaning duty with Maribel in the chapel only the night before. Maribel had seemed distracted, nervous in a way Helena had never seen. When Helena asked if something was wrong, Maribel whispered just 3 words: "I made a mistake." The next morning, Helena approached the administrative office to ask where Maribel had been transferred. The clerk avoided her eyes and said no record had been filed yet. That afternoon, Helena was summoned. Inside the private study, Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright sat alone, hands folded neatly on the desk. Her voice was calm, but sharp. Maribel's departure, she said, was a spiritual matter. Speaking about it would be considered disobedience. Then came the warning. The convent had recently struggled with donations. Rumors, Celestine explained, could damage the reputation of Saint Eloria, and anyone responsible would be dismissed from the order. Helena left the room shaken. That night, she noticed something else. The door to the small archive room, the place where Maribel often wrote late into the night, had been sealed with a temporary lock. By morning, the lock was gone. And inside the archive, an entire shelf of handwritten journals had vanished. Whatever mistake Maribel had made, someone was already erasing it. For nearly 20 years, Saint Eloria Convent remained untouched by scandal. Then, in 2023, the diocese approved long-delayed structural repairs to the old chapel foundation. Cracks had spread along the eastern wall, and the stone floor near the altar had begun to sink. The workers were not members of the church. They were contractors. On the third day of excavation, one of them struck something that wasn't stone. It was wood. At first, they believed it was part of an old storage box, possibly a forgotten relic chest. But when the lid splintered open, the smell rose immediately. Heavy, sweet, wrong. The job stopped within minutes. Police were called. Inside the narrow cavity beneath the chapel floor was a small, decayed coffin. There were no markings, no name, no blessing. Just a thin layer of dirt and broken tiles packed tightly around it, as if the space had been prepared in advance. When the forensic team opened the remains, one detail stunned everyone in the room. A rosary had been wrapped carefully around the skeletal hands. Not placed beside the body. Not laid across the chest. Tied. The coroner would later confirm what the sisters had quietly feared for decades. The remains belonged to a woman. And she had not been buried as part of any religious ceremony. She had been hidden. News of the discovery spread through Ravenshade in hours. By nightfall, every former sister of Saint Eloria was being contacted. Except one. Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright. When investigators arrived at the small residence she had occupied after retiring from the convent in 2018, the house was empty. The furniture remained. The kitchen was clean. A suitcase was missing. So were all personal documents. Her bank accounts had been closed 2 weeks earlier. Her phone number was disconnected. And her car, last registered under the convent's administrative trust, had quietly been sold to a private buyer in another county. To police, it did not look like panic. It looked like preparation. Detectives quickly confirmed something even more disturbing. The diocese had not been informed about the excavation beneath the chapel. The order to open the floor had been signed years earlier, but never carried out. That approval letter, found in diocesan records, bore a handwritten note at the bottom. Delay until further notice. Structural risk minimal. The handwriting, confirmed by church officials, belonged to Celestine Arkwright. For 2 decades, she had personally prevented any work that might disturb the chapel foundation. Now that the body had been found, the one person who controlled every decision inside Saint Eloria had disappeared without leaving a single trace. And for the first time, police publicly named her a person of interest. During a court-authorized search of the sealed archive room, investigators finally opened the trunk that had sat untouched at the foot of Maribel's bed for 20 years. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. None were addressed to family. All were addressed to one person, Father Laurent Kincaid. Kincaid had served as the convent's assigned spiritual director in the early 2000s. He no longer lived in Ravenshade. He had been transferred abruptly in late 2003 and later left the priesthood altogether. The letters were dated over several months. They were not romantic. They were confessional. Maribel described late-night meetings in the counseling room. She wrote about being pressured into secrecy, about being told that obedience was more important than truth, about being warned that exposing certain spiritual failures would destroy the reputation of the convent. One line appeared again and again. She says, "I will ruin everything." Another letter revealed the mistake Maribel had whispered about. She had copied administrative records, financial records. Donations meant for community shelters and orphan programs had been rerouted through private accounts connected to the convent trust. And every transaction required the final authorization of one person, Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright. For the first time, investigators had a motive that went far beyond discipline. Maribel hadn't broken a rule. She had discovered a system. One former sister finally agreed to speak. Her name was Sister Pauline Mercer. She had left Saint Eloria in 2006 and had never spoken publicly about her time there. When detectives showed her a photograph of Maribel, Pauline closed her eyes immediately. "I heard her," she said. Pauline explained that on the night Maribel supposedly left the convent, she had been assigned to night prayer duty in the West Corridor, directly across from the small counseling room. Just after midnight, she heard raised voices. One was Maribel's. The other belonged to Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright. Pauline could not hear the words clearly, but she remembered the sound of something heavy being knocked over. A chair. A small table. Then silence. Several minutes later, Celestine exited the room alone. She was not in her night habit. She was wearing gloves. Pauline said the detail haunted her for years. The next morning, the counseling room was locked. By afternoon, it had been completely rearranged. A new rug covered the floor. The furniture had been replaced, and the wooden confession screen had been removed without explanation. Pauline had wanted to speak up, but she had already watched two sisters be quietly dismissed for questioning leadership. Leaving the order had been her only escape. For investigators, her testimony reshaped the entire timeline. Maribel had never left Saint Eloria. She had died inside it. When forensic engineers re-examined the chapel foundation, they made a discovery that had never appeared on any architectural drawings. Beneath the eastern corner of the altar was a narrow service cavity, an unfinished space left behind during a renovation in the 1970s. It was not large enough to stand in, but it was large enough to hide something. Tool markings on the surrounding stone showed that the opening had been widened later, not during construction. The work had been done carefully, using hand tools instead of machinery. Slow, quiet, deliberate. Inside the cavity, investigators found fragments of modern tile mixed with older mortar. The floor above had been relaid to perfectly match the original chapel pattern. Someone had gone to extraordinary effort to make sure the space disappeared. Even more disturbing was what the forensic team found pressed into the softened mortar near the opening. A partial shoe imprint. The size and shape matched the brand and model worn by the sisters at Saint Eloria in the early 2000s. The same model listed on the inventory records signed by Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright. The chamber had not been used for storage. It had been prepared. And according to construction specialists, the cavity could only have been accessed from inside the chapel, during hours when the convent was closed to the public. Which meant the person who buried Maribel did not break in. They already had the keys. Detectives located Father Laurent Kincaid living quietly in a coastal town under a different surname. He agreed to speak, on one condition: no cameras, no recording devices. According to Kincaid, Maribel had approached him in late 2003 in absolute distress. She told him she had discovered financial records hidden behind restricted administrative files. When she asked why donation funds were being moved through private accounts, she was told it was temporary protection. Then she was warned. If the information left the convent, the entire order could be dissolved. Kincaid admitted he had urged Maribel to be patient, to allow church authorities to handle the matter internally. He said he planned to escalate the concern through diocesan channels. But before he could do so, he was transferred. Without explanation. Without farewell. The move happened in less than 48 hours. Kincaid said he later requested access to Maribel's case file. He was told there was no case, no departure paperwork, no disciplinary record, no transfer request. It was as if Maribel had never existed. His voice broke when he described the final conversation he had with her. She said she was going to speak directly to the superior, he told detectives. She said she didn't care what it cost her. She never made another call, and no confession was ever filed. By early summer, the investigation had reached an unbearable conclusion. The remains beneath the chapel were officially identified as Sister Maribel Vale through DNA comparison with a distant cousin. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty, but forensic specialists confirmed clear signs of perimortem trauma to the skull. It was ruled a homicide. But there was a problem. There was no suspect in custody. Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright remained missing. An international alert was quietly issued through law enforcement networks, but without proof of how Maribel was killed, prosecutors could not secure an arrest warrant. The financial trail, however, told its own story. Auditors uncovered nearly $900,000 in redirected charitable donations over a 6-year period. The accounts were controlled through layered trusts and religious administrative channels. All legal, all approved, all signed by the same hand. But Celestine had not directly received the money. It had been routed through church-controlled entities, then quietly dissolved into operating expenses. No personal enrichment. No luxury purchases. Just control. The money had sustained the convent when funding collapsed. To some within the church, that made her a problem solver. To investigators, it made her desperate. The tragedy of the case was now painfully clear. Everyone knew who had the power. Everyone knew who had the motive. But the only person who could answer for Maribel's death had vanished. And the grave beneath the chapel had closed before justice ever arrived. By the end of the year, Saint Eloria Convent stood permanently closed. The chapel was stripped of its pews. The stained glass windows were removed and placed into storage. What had once been a place of prayer became a sealed property tied to an unresolved homicide investigation. The final internal report confirmed what many already suspected. Mother Superior Celestine Arkwright had absolute authority over staffing, finances, discipline, and external communication. No decision, large or small, could bypass her signature. She had built a system where silence was survival. Investigators later confirmed that 2 days before the excavation began, Celestine had accessed an old administrative email account for the first time in years. From that account, a single message was sent to a former legal advisor. It read only one sentence. "They are finally opening the floor." After that message, there were no confirmed digital traces of her. No travel records. No new identity documents. No financial activity. Nothing. Whether Celestine planned Maribel's death, acted in sudden panic, or simply protected a collapsing institution at any cost, no court will ever hear her explanation. Because the only person who could fully explain what happened inside Saint Eloria was never charged, never questioned, and never found. If this story disturbed you, it should. Not because it took place inside a convent, but because it shows how easily absolute authority can erase a person when no one is allowed to challenge it. Sister Maribel Vale was not a criminal. She was not a runaway. She was a woman who believed that truth still mattered inside an institution built on faith. And it cost her everything. Cases like this don't survive on police files alone. They survive because people keep talking about them. They survive because viewers like you refuse to let names disappear just because time passes. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share Maribel's story with someone who believes justice should never depend on silence. And I want to ask you something. Do you believe Celestine Arkwright acted alone? Or do you think someone else inside Saint Eloria helped bury the truth, long before they buried a body? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, the only courtroom left is the public.